At 6:48 a.m. on February 12, 1945, Corporal Martin Robles submerged himself in freezing peat beneath a shattered root ball in Germany's Reichswald forest. German boot steps crunched through frozen underbrush 40 feet from his position. His company slept in their trenches, unaware of the platoon-strength ambush forming in the fog. In the next 90 minutes, Robles would ignore a direct order from his commanding officer and eliminate 22 Fallschirmjäger soldiers from a hide so disgraceful that Colonel Silas Vane had personally banned it. His arrest would begin 6 hours later. The Reichswald forest was where British doctrine went to die. Between February 8th and 12th, 1945, the waterlogged woodland along the Dutch-German border swallowed entire battalions. Tree-burst artillery turned the canopy into horizontal shrapnel. Visibility dropped to 20 yards in the morning fog. German defensive positions, invisible until the muzzle flash, controlled every sightline. The Canadian 2nd Division lost over 1,100 men in 4 days. The regulation sniper manuals said to seek elevated ground for observation. The elevated ground was a killing floor. The forest didn't care about textbooks or tradition. It just killed. Martin Robles learned to disappear in a forest that never forgot a mistake. The Olympic Peninsula in Washington state wasn't hostile like the Reichswald would be, but it was unforgiving in its own way. Moss grew on everything that stayed still too long. Rain fell 140 inches a year, turning the ground into a sponge that swallowed boot prints and ambitions alike. Martin's father, Vicente, logged old-growth Sitka spruce for the Polson Timber Company. He came home every night smelling like pitch and wet cedar, and he told his son the same thing every Sunday morning before their walks. The forest only sees what doesn't belong. Martin was 11 the first time he understood what that meant. Vicente took him moss hunting in the Hoh River Valley, teaching him to identify the specific species that furniture makers in Seattle paid cash for. Sheet moss, mood moss, spiky bog moss, each one required a different eye, a different patience. The rule was simple. If you disturbed the canopy, or snapped a branch, or left a visible trail, you'd return the next week to find your moss patch stripped clean by a competitor. Invisibility wasn't a trick. It was survival. By 13, Martin could move through dense undergrowth without cracking a single twig. He learned to read the forest's geometry, to recognize where shadows fell and how light moved through the canopy at different hours. He learned that elevation made you visible, that movement drew the eye, that the best hiding places were always the ones that looked like nothing at all. His father never called it camouflage.
He called it not being stupid. When Vicente died in 1936, crushed beneath a widowmaker that fell from 90 feet, Martin was 17 and already working the same timber tracts. He knew every root system, every depression in the forest floor, every place where a man could crouch beneath the world and become part of the rot and renewal. He didn't know that 8 years later, those lessons would keep him alive in a forest 5,000 miles away. He didn't know that the same instincts that helped him harvest moss would help him harvest lives. But the Olympic Peninsula had already decided what kind of soldier Martin Robles would become. The forest only sees what doesn't belong. Martin had learned how to belong to the shadows. Colonel Silas Vane arrived at Camp Toccoa in September 1943 with a leather-bound copy of the British Army's Notes on the Training of Snipers and a reputation for breaking men who questioned doctrine. He was 52, a veteran of the Meuse-Argonne in the First War, and he believed that soldiering was a science perfected through repetition and obedience. His sniper training program was built on 3 principles: elevated observation, regimented positioning, and the absolute supremacy of the manual. Deviation was weakness. Improvisation was cowardice. Martin Robles arrived 3 weeks later, one of 47 men selected for advanced marksmanship. The first drill was simple: establish a firing position on high ground, maintain a 60-degree sight line, and eliminate targets at 400 yards. Vane walked the line with a measuring tape and a stopwatch, checking angles, distances, and the precise placement of sandbags. When Private Chernak suggested moving his position 15 feet lower to avoid skylining, Vane had him scrubbing latrines for a week. "The manual is written in the blood of smarter men than you," Vane said. "You will learn it, or you will die ignorant." By November, 12 men had washed out. The rest could recite firing tables and wind calculations in their sleep. But Martin noticed something the manual didn't account for. Every ideal position Vane drilled into them was a death sentence in actual woodland. High ground meant exposure. Regimented spacing meant predictable patterns. The doctrine assumed open terrain, clear sightlines, and an enemy who fought by the same rules. The Reichswald would have none of those things. Martin kept his observations to himself. He scored expert on every qualification, but never volunteered an opinion. Vane noticed his silence and mistook it for respect. During a December field exercise, Martin built his hide 8 feet lower than the designated position, tucked beneath a fallen log where the shadows pooled. He hit 14 out of 15 targets. Vane found him afterward, standing over the hide with his jaw clenched. "This is not where I told you to set up, Corporal." Martin nodded. "No, sir." Vane kicked the log. "If I ever see you freelancing again, you'll wish the Germans got to you first."
If you believe soldiers deserve better than being sent to their deaths by arrogant textbook officers like Vane, hit subscribe. Only those who value mindless obedience over human life will skip this. The Reichswald forest announced itself 6 miles before the company reached it. A low fog bank sat over the tree line like a burial shroud, and the sound of artillery carried through the frozen air in rolling waves. On February 8, 1945, Martin Robles and the rest of Charlie Company crossed into Germany as part of Operation Veritable, the British-Canadian push to clear the west bank of the Rhine. The briefing had been simple. Advance through the forest, secure the high ground, establish firing positions. Nobody mentioned that the forest had already killed 1,100 Canadians in 4 days. Nobody mentioned that German artillery crews had spent 3 months pre-sighting every approach. The trees were Douglas fir and European beech, 80 to 100 feet tall, their trunks black from winter rain. The ground was a nightmare of mud, ice, and standing water that turned every step into a gamble. Visibility dropped to 30 yards. The canopy was so dense that even in daylight, the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. Martin recognized the terrain immediately. It was the Olympic Peninsula stripped of mercy, a place where elevation and concealment couldn't coexist. The first tree burst hit at 9:47 a.m. on their second day in. An 88mm shell detonated 40 feet above the ground, and the explosion turned the canopy into a horizontal storm of wood shrapnel moving at 3,000 feet per second. Private Dennison was decapitated by a branch the size of a fence post. Corporal Hayes took a 6-inch splinter through his thigh and bled out in 4 minutes. The medic, Kowalski, was hit in the chest by fragments so small they looked like sawdust until you saw the blood. 7 men died before the second shell hit, 11 more after that. Tree-burst artillery didn't just kill soldiers, it erased them. Bodies were found in pieces, scattered across 40-foot blast radii. Dog tags melted into flesh. The forest became a vertical killing field where overhead cover was the weapon. The German crews didn't need to see their targets, they just needed to know the trees were there. By the 3rd day, Charlie Company had lost 38 men and advanced 400 yards. Colonel Vane established sniper positions on the ridgeline exactly as the manual specified. Elevated observation, clear fields of fire, maximum range. The first 3 teams were obliterated within an hour. The German gunners had zeroed every piece of high ground weeks ago. Vane ordered the 4th team into position anyway. Martin watched them climb and thought about his father crushed beneath a widowmaker. The forest only sees what doesn't belong. Vane was sending men into the canopy like they belonged there. The forest was teaching him otherwise, one corpse at a time. Martin started building the hide on the night of February 10th, working by touch in absolute darkness. He found a spot 40 yards behind the front line where a massive beech root had been torn up by shell fire, creating a depression 3 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The frozen mud was the consistency of wet concrete, and he dug into it with his entrenching tool and bare hands, widening the cavity until he could fit his body horizontally beneath the root mass. He wove dead branches across the opening at ground level, then packed wet moss and mud over the framework until it looked like nothing, just another wound in the forest floor. The principle was simple: eliminate the vertical profile. No silhouette, no shadow, no angle for artillery to exploit. He would fire through a 6-inch gap at ground level, his muzzle recessed into the hide so the flash wouldn't give him away. It was the exact inverse of everything Vane had taught. It was also the only position in the entire sector that wouldn't get him killed in the first 10 minutes. Vane found the hide at 0600 on February 11th during his morning inspection. Martin was inside, testing sight lines, when he heard boots stop above him. "Corporal Robles, get out of that hole." Martin emerged, covered in mud from his helmet to his boots, his face streaked with peat and charcoal. Vane stared at him like he'd crawled out of a grave. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" "Building a firing position, sir." "That is not a firing position. That is a sewer. You look like a goddamn swamp rat." "Sir, the elevated positions are—" "I don't care what you think about the elevated positions. You will follow doctrine, or I will have you digging latrines until the war ends." Vane turned to the assembled squad. "This man thinks he's smarter than the manual. This man thinks wallowing in filth is soldiering. If any of you are tempted to follow his example, remember that cowards hide in the dirt while men fight from the high ground." Martin said nothing. Vane kicked mud into the hide. "Kill it in. That's an order." Martin filled it in. That night, he built another one 60 yards west. He didn't tell anyone. Comment, "Justice for rubles," if you aren't siding with Colonel Vane's ego. Let's see who actually values the man on the ground. The German counterattack began at 0640 on February 12th with a 30-minute artillery barrage that turned the forward positions into kindling. Tree bursts walked through the company sector in methodical intervals, each explosion sending horizontal waves of shrapnel through the gray morning fog. By 0710, the shelling stopped and the forest went silent. That silence lasted exactly 90 seconds. Private Jennings, manning the forward observation post on the eastern ridge, saw them first. Gray uniforms moving through the fog in a skirmish line 200 yards wide. Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, veteran soldiers who'd held casino for 4 months and knew how to kill in close terrain. Jennings counted at least 40 men, possibly more in the fog. He grabbed for the field phone. The line was dead, severed by artillery. He fired 3 shots into the air, the signal for enemy contact, and was hit by return fire before the 3rd casing hit the ground. The gray wave came fast. German MG-42 machine guns opened up from concealed positions, firing 1,200 rounds per minute in 6-second bursts that chewed through the regulation defensive positions like paper. The high ground nests that Vane had insisted on were the first to die. Corporal Marsh and his spotter were hit before they could traverse their rifle. Sergeant Chen's position took a potato masher grenade that left nothing intact enough to identify. Private First Class DeMarco tried to retreat from his elevated post and was cut down in the open, his body tumbling 15 feet into the frozen mud. The German advance was textbook: suppress, flank, close. They moved in pairs, using the forest's natural cover exactly the way the Allied manual said not to: low, dispersed, invisible until they were on top of you. Charlie Company's defensive line collapsed in 8 minutes. Men abandoned their positions and fell back to the secondary trench, which hadn't been reinforced because Vane had insisted the primary line was mathematically sufficient. By 0725, the Germans were 60 yards from the company command post. 43 Allied soldiers were pinned in a trench designed for 20, unable to maneuver, unable to see their attackers through the fog and smoke. Vane was screaming into a radio, demanding artillery support that wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes. The Fallschirmjäger were fixing bayonets. Martin Robles, lying in a hole the army had ordered him not to use, could see all of it. Martin's first shot was at 0727. A German squad leader, 85 yards out, moving between two shattered pine trees with his arm raised to signal the final assault. Martin exhaled, let his heartbeat settle, and squeezed. The Lee Enfield kicked against his shoulder with a sound like a branch snapping. The German dropped face first into the mud. The men behind him froze, scanning the ridgeline where every other sniper had died. They didn't look down. Nobody ever looked down. Second shot, 0729. A machine gunner setting up an MG-42 on a fallen log, 92 yards northwest. Martin adjusted for a slight crosswind, fired, and watched the gunner fold backward. The number 2 man grabbed for the weapon. Third shot, 0730. The forest swallowed the sound, and the German line hesitated. They still didn't know where it was coming from.
Martin worked the bolt, chambered another round, and felt the cold certainty that he was ending his career with every trigger pull. Vane had made it explicit, use this hide and face court-martial, but the men in that trench were his company. Kowalski the medic who'd shared his rations, DeMarco who'd lent him a dry pair of socks. They were dying because Vane cared more about doctrine than reality, and Martin had exactly one advantage, a position so low, so invisible that the enemy couldn't process it even when they tried. Fourth shot, 0733. An officer with binoculars, 78 yards east. Fifth shot, 0735. A rifleman attempting to flank left through a drainage ditch. The Germans were adapting now, going to ground, trying to identify the threat. Martin saw one soldier point toward his position, then shake his head and point at the ridge. The human brain rejected the possibility of ground-level fire. It looked for elevation, for silhouettes, for familiar shapes. 6th through 9th shots, 0738 to 0844. Methodical. A grenadier. A runner. 2 riflemen trying to suppress the Allied trench. Martin's breathing was mechanical, his hands steady despite the cold that had turned his fingers gray. He wasn't thinking about Vane anymore. He was thinking about geometry, about angles, about the fact that his father had taught him to harvest moss without disturbing the canopy, and he was now harvesting lives from beneath the forest floor. 10th shot, 0748. The German advance stalled. They'd lost their squad leaders, their machine gun support, and their forward momentum. The survivors were pinned behind inadequate cover, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat under fire from a ghost they couldn't locate. Shots 11 through 18, 0752 to 0813. The Germans tried to withdraw in pairs. Martin killed them methodically, prioritizing targets by threat level exactly as the manual taught, from a position the manual said couldn't exist. By 0820, the gray wave had broken. 19 bodies lay scattered in the killing field. 3 more would be found later, wounded and frozen. The Fallschirmjäger who'd held Casino had been stopped by 1 man in the mud. Martin stayed in the hide until 0840, watching for movement, counting bodies, knowing that when he crawled out, Colonel Vane would be waiting. Hit subscribe if you believe true genius should be celebrated, not punished. Only gatekeepers and trolls who hate innovation will ignore this. The body count was completed by 1100 hours. 22 confirmed German dead, scattered across 120 yards of forest in a pattern that artillery couldn't have produced. The intelligence officer, Captain Reese, walked the killing field with a map and a growing sense of disbelief. Every kill shot had come from the same firing position, a position that shouldn't have existed according to every tactical manual in the Allied arsenal. He found the hide at 11:30, a depression beneath a root mass that looked like natural terrain until you were standing directly over it. Charlie Company had lost 4 men in the counterattack. Without Martin's intervention, the entire unit would have been overrun. The survivors knew it. When Martin emerged from the hide at 0845, covered in frozen mud and moving like a man twice his age, Corporal Hayes had tried to shake his hand. Private Kowalski offered him coffee from his canteen. Sergeant Chen, whose sniper position had been obliterated the day before, simply nodded and said, "You saved us." Colonel Vane said nothing until 1400 hours. He found Martin sitting outside the command post cleaning his rifle with a field rag. The rest of the company was digging in, reinforcing positions, preparing for another attack that wouldn't come. Vane stood over Martin for a full 30 seconds before speaking. "You disobeyed a direct order." Martin didn't look up. "Yes, sir." "You used a firing position I explicitly forbade." "Yes, sir." 22 enemy combatants are dead because of your actions." "Yes, sir." Vane's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. Around them, the forest had gone silent. No artillery, no small arms fire, just the wind moving through shattered trees and the sound of men who'd been hours from death, now laughing over cigarettes. "You will surrender your rifle and report to the stockade," Vane said. "You are under arrest for willful disobedience and conduct unbecoming. I will not have indiscipline in my command, regardless of the outcome." Martin handed over his Lee Enfield without a word. Captain Reese, standing 15 feet away, started to say something, then stopped. The man of Charlie Company watched in silence as 2 MPs led Martin away. Nobody cheered, nobody protested. They just watched their best chance of survival disappear into a tent with bars, punished for the crime of keeping them alive. Vane returned to his command post and wrote his after-action report. The word sniper appeared twice. Martin Robles's name appeared once in the section marked disciplinary actions. The 22 dead Germans were attributed to effective defensive fire. If you despise leaders who play God with other people's lives to cover their own mistakes, comment, "No more lions led by donkeys." The court-martial convened on March 3, 1945, in a requisitioned schoolhouse 12 miles behind the front lines. 3 officers sat behind a table scarred with cigarette burns and ink stains. Colonel Vane presented the case himself. The charges were simple: willful disobedience of a direct order, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and unauthorized modification of tactical doctrine. Maximum sentence, 5 years hard labor and dishonorable discharge. Vane's testimony lasted 14 minutes. He described Martin's unauthorized firing position as a violation of established procedure that undermines unit cohesion and sets a dangerous precedent for indiscipline. He referenced the British Sniper Manual 3 times. He did not mention the 22 dead Germans. He did not mention that Charlie Company was still operational because of Martin's actions. He mentioned only that Martin had been explicitly ordered to abandon the Mud and Branch hide and had built another one in direct defiance. Captain Reese testified for the defense. He brought photographs of the kill zone, a map showing firing angles, and a written statement from Sergeant Chen describing the tactical situation. The presiding officer, a major named Hollister, interrupted him twice to ask if any of this changed the fact that Corporal Robles had disobeyed a direct order. Reese admitted it did not. Martin was asked if he wished to make a statement. He stood, still wearing the same uniform he'd been arrested in, the mud stains now dried to a gray crust. "I was ordered to use a firing position that would have gotten me killed in under 10 minutes. I chose a position that kept me alive and kept my friends breathing. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty." The senior officer, Colonel Brennan, leaned forward. "Corporal, do you understand that military discipline requires obedience even when you disagree with orders?" "I understand that, sir." "Then why didn't you follow your orders?" "Because 22 Germans were about to overrun my company, and Colonel Vane's orders would have made me irrelevant or dead. I chose effectiveness over obedience." "And you don't regret that choice?" "No, sir. I regret that I had to make it." The court deliberated for 18 minutes. Martin was found guilty on all charges. Sentence: reduction in rank to private, 60 days confinement, forfeiture of 2 months' pay. Dishonorable discharge was recommended but not imposed, likely because the war was still on and bodies were needed. Vane left the schoolhouse without looking at Martin.
Captain Reese shook Martin's hand and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. Martin Robles was 73 years old when he saw the photograph. It was October 1995, and he was sitting in the VA clinic in Port Angeles waiting for a prescription refill, flipping through a copy of Soldier of Fortune magazine that someone had left on the waiting room table. Page 47. A U.S. Marine sniper in full ghillie suit, prone in tall grass, completely invisible except for the faint outline of his scope. The caption read, "Modern concealment techniques prioritize low-profile positioning and natural camouflage integration."
Martin stared at the photo for 3 minutes without moving. The Marine was doing exactly what he'd done 50 years ago in the Reichswald. Ground-level hide, natural materials woven into cover, elimination of vertical profile. The techniques that had gotten Martin court-martialed were now being taught at sniper schools in Quantico and Fort Benning. The mud had finally won. He'd never talked much about the war. His wife, Rosa, knew he'd been a sniper and that something had happened with his commanding officer, but Martin had never explained the specifics. His sons knew he'd served in Germany and come home with a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds he'd received 2 weeks after his court-martial. Nobody knew about the 22 Germans or the hole in the ground or the officer who'd punished effectiveness because it made doctrine look stupid. Martin folded the magazine and put it back on the table. A young Marine in dress blues sat down across from him, early 20s, fresh haircut, the kind of sharp-edged competence that Martin recognized from a different century. The kid noticed Martin's VFW cap. "You served, sir?" "Long time ago." "What unit?" "Sniper, European theater." The Marine's face lit up. "No shit! I just graduated Scout Sniper School last month. Best training in the world. They teach us these insane concealment techniques, ground-level hides, natural camouflage, stuff that makes you invisible." Martin smiled for the first time in the conversation. "You teach that now?" "Hell yes, sir. It's the future of precision fire. Low profile beats elevation every time." Martin nodded slowly. "Good. That's real good." He wanted to tell the kid that the future was 50 years old. He wanted to explain that men died because officers cared more about manuals than math. He wanted to say that he'd been punished for discovering what this Marine was now being praised for learning. Instead, he just shook the kid's hand and said, "Stay low, stay smart." The Marine left. Martin sat in the waiting room until his name was called, thinking about Colonel Vane, who died in 1967 without ever admitting he'd been wrong. Thinking about the men of Charlie Company who'd watched him get arrested for saving their lives. Thinking about the forest that only sees what doesn't belong, and how it took half a century for the Army to understand that sometimes the best soldiers are the ones who disappear. Subscribe if you stand for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Only those who prefer lies and corruption will look the other way. The effectiveness of Robles's blind relied on what modern tactical analysts call the shadow ratio principle. By positioning his hide below the root line rather than above ground level, Martin eliminated the cast shadow that betrays conventional sniper positions. Elevated hides create geometric signatures, angles, edges, silhouettes that the human eye
instinctively recognizes as unnatural. Ground-level concealment exploits negative space utilization, embedding the shooter within the terrain's existing shadow architecture rather than adding to it. Colonel Vane saw mud and filth. Martin Robles saw a mathematical shield that rendered the human form invisible to the naked eye. 50 years later, every special operations sniper school in the world teaches variations of the technique that got him court-martialed.